I'm working on a book about Sasquatch encounters across North America. Nothing serious or academic, just collecting stories from different towns and communities that claim to have sightings. I'd already visited a dozen places before reaching Willow Creek. Small mountain towns, logging communities, places where people swore they'd seen something in the woods. Most of those stories felt thin, like local legends that had been embellished over time, told and retold until nobody could remember what had actually happened versus what had been added later. Willow Creek was supposed to be just another stop on my research trip, another dot on the map, another week of interviews before moving on. The town sits in Humboldt County, tucked deep into the mountains of Northern California, completely surrounded by the Six Rivers National Forest. Population around 1,700, give or take. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where strangers get noticed immediately, where the nearest hospital is 45 minutes away on winding mountain roads that test your nerves and your transmission. Winter snows can cut the town off from the outside world for days at a time. Cell service is spotty at best. It's the kind of isolation that either draws you in or makes you claustrophobic, depending on who you are. I rolled into town on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The sky was that particular shade of gray you only get in mountain country, heavy with clouds that look like they might turn into rain or snow depending on the temperature. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke, sharp and clean. The kind of smell that reminds you how far you are from any city. The mountains rose up on all sides like walls holding the world at bay, their peaks already dusted with early snow. I checked into a small motel on the edge of town, the kind with peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered intermittently, spelling out vacancy in stuttering red letters, and headed straight to the local diner for dinner. I was tired from the drive, hungry, and hoping to start chatting with locals right away. Small-town diners are usually good for that. People are curious about strangers, willing to talk over coffee. That's where I first noticed something different about Willow Creek. I'd been to other Bigfoot hotspots before this trip. In those places, people either treated the subject like a joke or spoke about it in hushed, fearful tones. But here, the waitress mentioned Bigfoot the way you'd mention a neighbor. Casual, almost affectionate. I was sitting at the counter working my way through a burger and fries when I overheard two guys at a nearby table talking. One of them was saying something about checking his fence line, and the other one said, "Well, if you get lost out there, don't worry. He'll point you home." They both laughed, but it wasn't the nervous laugh of people telling scary stories. It was comfortable, familiar. I couldn't help myself. I introduced myself, told them about my book, and asked what they meant. The older of the two men, weathered face, calloused hands, probably in his 60s, looked at me like I just asked why water was wet. "The Bigfoot," he said simply. "He looks after folks around here. Always has." That's when I learned Willow Creek's secret. This wasn't a town that feared Bigfoot or laughed at the idea of Bigfoot. This was a town that believed Bigfoot was their protector, their guardian. And over the next few days, as I interviewed locals at the gas station, the general store, the post office, and that same diner, I heard story after story that all pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Something in these woods was watching over these people. Something big, something intelligent, and something that had been doing it for generations. The first story I heard in detail came from a woman who worked at the general store. She was probably in her 40s, with tired eyes and hands that moved constantly while she talked, stacking cans, wiping down the counter, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. She told me what happened to her son back in the 90s. Her family had gone camping at one of the established sites in the National Forest, just a few miles from town. Nothing adventurous, just a weekend getaway in a spot they'd been to before, a place they thought was safe and familiar. Her son was 6 years old at the time, curious, energetic, the kind of kid who was always exploring, always finding things nobody else noticed. A cool rock, an interesting bug, a tree that looked perfect for climbing. They'd warned him repeatedly not to wander off, had explained about getting lost in the woods, but you know how kids are at that age. They hear you, but they don't really understand. The forest seems like a big playground to them, not something that could swallow them up and never let them go. One minute he was playing near the campsite, throwing pine cones at a tree trunk, and the next minute he was gone. Just gone. They called his name, looked behind the tent, checked down by the creek where they'd told him not to go. Nothing. Panic set in fast, the way it does when you suddenly realize your child isn't where they're supposed to be. They organized a search party immediately. The father drove back to town to get help while the mother stayed at the campsite in case the boy came back. Friends, neighbors, forest rangers, everyone who could spare a hand came out to help. The word spread fast the way it does in small towns, and within an hour there were 30 people combing through the woods. But the terrain around there is brutal. Thick undergrowth that catches at your clothes and scratches your skin, steep ravines that drop away suddenly, dense trees that block out the sun even at midday. They searched for hours, calling his name over and over, combing through the woods with flashlights as darkness fell. Every snap of a branch brought hope that quickly died when it turned out to be just another searcher or an animal moving through the underbrush. The mother stayed at the campsite like she'd been told, calling out for her son all night long, her voice getting hoarser with each hour until she could barely speak above a whisper but kept trying anyway. She didn't sleep, she couldn't, she just kept calling and calling, hoping he'd hear her and find his way back. The search parties had to stop when it got too dark. The forest at night is dangerous even for experienced adults, and they didn't want anyone else getting lost or hurt. Dawn came cold and gray. The mother was still at the campsite, exhausted and terrified, when she saw movement at the tree line. Her son walked out of the forest, calm as could be, wrapped up in pine boughs like a blanket. No scratches, no injuries, not even scared, just tired. When they asked him what happened, he said a big, hairy man had found him in the dark. The man had kept him warm, given him berries to eat, and carried him toward the voices calling his name. The boy described the man as gentle, careful not to scratch him on branches, and quiet, so quiet the boy said he couldn't even hear his footsteps. The search party found footprints near where the boy had emerged from the woods. Massive prints, easily twice the size of a man's boot, pressed deep into the soft earth. They followed the trail back into the forest, watching it weave through terrain that would have been impossible for a 6-year-old to navigate alone. The tracks led deep into the wilderness, then circled back toward the campsite, as if whoever or whatever had made them knew exactly where to bring the boy. The woman stopped rearranging cans when she finished telling me this. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "You can believe it or not. I don't really care. But my son came home safe when he shouldn't have, and something out there made sure of it." The next story came from a retired couple I met at the post office. They were in their 70s, both thin and wiry in the way people get when they spend their whole lives being active outdoors. They'd lived in Willow Creek for 40 years, owned a small cabin on the outskirts of town with several acres of forest behind it. This happened maybe 20 years ago, early 2000s. They were hiking one of their usual trails, the one they'd walked 100 times before. It was late spring and they were enjoying the weather, not really paying attention to much except the birds and the wildflowers starting to bloom. They rounded a bend and nearly stepped on a bear cub. Just a little thing, probably only a few months old, snuffling around in some bushes. The husband grabbed his wife's arm to pull her back, but they didn't move fast enough. The mother bear came crashing out of the underbrush, roaring, already charging. The husband tripped trying to backpedal, went down hard on the trail. His wife was screaming, frozen in place. The bear was maybe 20 feet away and closing fast. They both knew they were done for. You don't outrun a bear, you don't fight a bear, especially not a mother protecting her cub. Then they heard another roar. This one came from the opposite direction, deeper and louder than the bear's. The sound seemed to come from something with a much bigger chest cavity, something that could really project. An enormous figure crashed through the underbrush, 8, maybe 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur, moving fast. The thing positioned itself between the bear and the couple. The bear skidded to a stop, suddenly uncertain. The two creatures faced each other for what the wife said felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. The Bigfoot didn't charge, didn't attack. Just stood there, tall and imposing, between the couple and the bear. The mother bear made a huffing sound, gathered up her cub, and retreated into the forest. The couple stayed frozen on the ground, too shocked to move. The creature turned its head to look at them, just once, brief, then climbed up the slope and disappeared into the trees. They both saw it clearly, the way it moved, the size of it, the intelligence in that one glance. When they finally got the strength to stand up, they found a massive handprint on a nearby tree trunk, right at the level where something very tall would have steadied itself while climbing the slope. The bark was freshly disturbed, sap still oozing from where the weight had pressed into it. The husband took measurements later with a tape measure from home. The handprint was nearly 10 inches across. The third story came from a guy who worked at the gas station. He was in his 30s when I talked to him, but he told me about something that happened to him and his girlfriend about 15 years earlier in the winter of 2008. They'd been driving home late one night after visiting friends in the next town over. Nothing unusual about the trip. They'd made the drive dozens of times before. But the roads up here get treacherous in winter. They're narrow and winding, carved into mountainsides with steep drops on one side and rock faces on the other. There's not much traffic late at night, which means the county road crews don't always prioritize them for salting after a storm. The snow had been falling lightly when they started driving, nothing that seemed dangerous. Then the temperature dropped and the wet road turned to ice. They hit a patch of black ice on a curve, the kind you can't see until it's too late. The car started to spin, slowly at first, then faster. They both remember the stomach-dropping sensation of losing control, the car sliding sideways toward the edge. Then they went over. The car rolled down an embankment, tumbling over and over. The sounds were terrible. Metal crunching, glass shattering, their own screams mixing with the horrible noise of the crash. Then everything went black. He woke up lying on the ground about 20 feet from the car, which was on its roof and burning. His girlfriend was next to him, unconscious but breathing. He had no memory of getting out of the vehicle. The last thing he remembered was the sickening lurch as the car went over the edge and started rolling. After that, nothing. But when he looked around, trying to get his bearings through the pain and confusion, he saw tracks in the snow. Enormous barefoot prints, each one easily 18 inches long, leading from the overturned car to where he and his girlfriend lay. There were drag marks in the snow too, parallel grooves where something had pulled their bodies to safety. The fire department arrived maybe 15 minutes later. When the paramedics examined them, they were baffled. Both of them had injuries consistent with a rollover crash, broken ribs, concussions, lacerations. But there was no way either of them could have crawled out of that car on their own, not with those injuries and not in their condition. And yet someone had pulled them clear before the fire really took hold. The fire chief took photos of the tracks before they got trampled. Nobody could explain them. Too big for a person, wrong shape for a bear, and besides, what bear would pull two people out of a burning car? The firefighters joked nervously about it, but they didn't have another explanation. The guy at the gas station showed me the scars on his arms and chest while he told me this. He said he thinks about it sometimes, lying in bed at night. Someone saved their lives, pulled them from a burning vehicle when they were unconscious and helpless. He said he owes his life to something he'll never understand. At the diner the next day, I met a man who told me about something that happened to him in 2012. He was a solo hiker, the kind who liked to push himself on difficult trails, camping alone in the backcountry for days at a time. He knew what he was doing out there, had years of experience, proper equipment, always told people where he was going. He was about 8 miles into the forest on a trail that didn't see much traffic when he stepped wrong on some loose rocks. His ankle rolled and he heard the snap. He knew immediately it was broken. The pain was intense, and he was miles from the trailhead with no cell service and no way to call for help. He tried crawling, made it maybe 100 yards before he had to stop, exhausted and nauseous from the pain. The sun was starting to set. He was facing a night alone in the forest with a broken ankle, no way to move, and no guarantee anyone would find him before dehydration or exposure set in. He passed out from the pain and exhaustion. When he woke up, it was dawn, and he was lying near the trailhead parking lot, propped up against the information sign. His ankle was wrapped in large leaves, looked like mullein, bound together with some kind of vine. It was a crude splint, but it was holding his ankle stable. His backpack was sitting beside him, and his water bottle had been uncapped and placed within easy reach. He was too stunned to process it at first. Then he started looking around and saw the tracks, massive footprints in the dirt leading from the parking lot back into the forest. When search and rescue found him an hour later, he'd managed to use his emergency whistle. They followed the drag marks. Whatever had moved him had carried or dragged him for 8 miles through rough terrain in the dark. The paramedics were impressed by the splint. One of them said whoever did it knew what they were doing. The leaves provided padding and the vine wrap was tight enough to stabilize, but not so tight it cut off circulation. They asked him who helped him, and he told them the truth. They didn't believe him, of course, wrote it up as confusion from the injury, but he knew he was there. And he said the thing that stuck with him most wasn't the rescue itself, it was the care that went into it. The careful placement of the leaves, the precise tension of the vine, the water bottle uncapped and positioned perfectly. Whatever helped him had been gentle, deliberate, almost tender. An elderly man who lived alone in a cabin about 3 miles from the nearest neighbor told me what happened to him one winter night in 2015. He was in his late 70s then, lived by himself by choice, preferred the solitude and the quiet of the forest to the bustle of town. He had a space heater in his bedroom, one of those old ceramic ones with the orange coils that glow when they get hot. He'd been using it for years without any problems. Something went wrong with it that night. Maybe the wiring finally gave out, maybe something fell on it and he didn't notice. Maybe it was just time for it to fail. He was asleep when it happened, deep in that dreamless sleep you get when you're exhausted and comfortable. He didn't smell the smoke. The carbon monoxide from the burning materials would have put him even deeper under, making it impossible to wake up naturally. He didn't hear the crackling of the flames spreading from the heater to the curtains, from the curtains to the walls. The smoke inhalation should have killed him in his sleep. That's how most people die in house fires. They never wake up, never even know what's happening. It's supposed to be a peaceful way to go if there is such a thing. But he didn't die. He woke up on his front lawn, coughing and gasping, with his cabin fully engulfed behind him. His chest hurt like someone had kicked him. He was confused, disoriented, couldn't remember leaving the cabin. The last thing he remembered was falling asleep in his bed. A neighbor 3 miles away saw the glow and called the fire department. By the time they arrived, the cabin was a total loss. They found the old man sitting on his lawn, wrapped in a blanket he'd apparently grabbed watching his home burn. When they checked him over, they found a massive bruise across his chest, dark purple, the shape suggesting something large had grabbed him or dragged him. The fire investigator examined what was left of the cabin the next day. The door had been smashed inward from the outside, not unlocked, not kicked in, but literally destroyed. Whatever broke through that door had hit it with enough force to splinter the frame. The investigator said no human could have done that. It would take either a battering ram or something incredibly strong. The deputies found prints in the muddy ground around the cabin, barefoot, human-shaped, but 18 inches long and deep enough to suggest enormous weight. The prints led from the broken door to where the old man had been found, then disappeared back into the forest. The old man told me this story sitting in that same diner, drinking coffee with hands that shook slightly. He'd moved into town after the fire, couldn't afford to rebuild. He said he doesn't remember being saved, but he knows he was. Something broke down his door, pulled him out of that smoke-filled cabin, and dragged him to safety while he was unconscious. He said he owes every day since then to whatever was strong enough and cared enough to do that. There's a creek that runs through the national forest, about 2 miles from town. It's a popular spot in summer, shallow enough for kids to play in, cold mountain water surrounded by trees. Families go there all the time for picnics and swimming. In the summer of 2017, one family was spending the afternoon there. It was a Sunday, warm and bright, the kind of perfect summer day that makes you grateful to be alive. Parents, 3 kids ranging from 8 to 15, a pretty normal family outing. They'd brought sandwiches and snacks, spread out a blanket on the bank, and were just enjoying being together outside. The kids were playing in the water, supervised, but not hovered over the way parents hover over toddlers. They were old enough to swim, old enough to be trusted in shallow water. The parents were sitting on the bank, watching, talking about nothing important, occasionally calling out reminders to be careful or not splash your sister. Just a normal, peaceful afternoon that should have stayed normal and peaceful. There had been heavy rain earlier that week up in the mountains where the snowmelt fed into the creeks. The water level was higher than normal and the current was stronger, but you couldn't really tell from looking at it. The surface still looked calm, peaceful, safe. It was underneath where the danger lurked, in currents that could pull you under before you realized what was happening. The youngest daughter, 8 years old, was waiting near the edge where the water was only knee-deep. She took a step and suddenly there was nothing under her foot. She'd stepped into a hole, one of those underwater depressions that form when the current scours out the creek bed. The current caught her before she could react, pulled her under, and swept her downstream faster than anyone could have anticipated. She didn't even have time to scream. 1 second she was there, and the next second she was gone, pulled under the surface and carried away by water that was much more powerful than it looked. Her teenage brother was the only one who saw it happen. He heard the splash, saw the splash, turned, and saw something massive reaching into the water downstream. He ran toward it, shouting for his parents, his heart pounding. By the time he got there, his sister was lying on the bank, coughing up water, soaking wet, and scared but alive. There were enormous wet handprints on the rocks beside her, more prints on the trees, at a height that suggested something very tall had been moving through the forest beside the creek. The rocks and moss were disturbed in a pattern that showed something had reached down into the fast-moving water and pulled her out. The girl remembered being underwater, the current pulling her, the panic of not knowing which way was up. Then something grabbed her, big arms, hairy, strong, but not rough. She remembered being lifted straight up out of the water and set down on the bank. She said the thing that grabbed her smelled like the forest, like pine needles and dirt and something wild. The teenage brother swears he saw it for just a second before it vanished into the trees. He said it was huge, covered in dark reddish-brown fur, and it moved through the forest without making a sound. 1 second it was there, and the next second it was gone. After 3 days of interviews, I started to see the pattern. These weren't random stories. They were too consistent, too detailed, too similar in the ways that mattered. People weren't embellishing or trying to one-up each other. They were just telling me what happened. I met an old-timer at the general store, a man who'd lived in Willow Creek his entire life, going on 80 years. He told me this wasn't new. His father had told him stories from the logging days in the 20s and 30s. Loggers working deep in the forest, one of them crushed by a fallen tree. When the crew came back with help, they found him moved away from the worksite, positioned carefully in a clearing where he'd be easy to spot. His injuries suggested someone had extracted him from under the tree with incredible care, trying not to make things worse. The old-timer said the Native Americans who lived in this area before white settlers arrived had stories about a forest guardian, a protector who watched over those who respected the land. He said maybe the old stories had more truth in them than people gave them credit for. I talked to the local doctor, a woman who'd been practicing in Willow Creek for 20 years. She was careful with her words, clearly didn't want to sound crazy, but she told me she'd treated injuries over the years where the victim's story didn't match their wounds. People saying they dragged themselves out of danger when their injuries made that physically impossible. People found in locations they couldn't have reached on their own. She said something else too. She said Willow Creek has a lower emergency death rate than surrounding communities. Despite being more isolated, despite having longer emergency response times, despite the harsh terrain, she couldn't explain it medically. People who should have died from exposure survived. Lost hikers got found in time. Accident victims ended up in positions where they could be saved. I checked the search and rescue records at the ranger station. The ranger on duty, a gruff man in his 50s who didn't seem like the type to believe in fairy tales, confirmed it. Willow Creek had an unusually high success rate for finding missing people. He said they often found people in unexpected places, near trails, near roads, in clearings that seemed chosen for visibility. And the people they found often had strange stories about how they got there. One of the older residents told me a story from the 70s. She'd been a young mother then, living on a small homestead outside of town with her husband and 3 kids. They relied on a well for their water, hand-dug and lined with stone, the way wells used to be. The water started tasting strange one week, foul, almost metallic. They didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes well water changed taste with the seasons or after heavy rains. But then the kids started getting sick. Nothing dramatic, just tired and nauseous, the kind of thing you might chalk up to a flu going around. Early one morning, she was woken by violent pounding on the front door. She ran downstairs expecting to find a neighbor in trouble, but there was nobody there. No car in the driveway, no footprints on the porch. She was about to go back inside when she noticed the well. There was a massive rock sitting directly on top of the wooden cover, a boulder that hadn't been there the night before. Her husband tried to move the rock. It wouldn't budge. They eventually had to rig up a pulley system to shift it. When they finally got it off and opened the well cover, they saw the water was murky, contaminated. They called the county, got it tested. Toxic runoff from an old mine site had seeped into the water table. The levels were dangerous, especially for children. The rock weighed over 400 pounds. The county inspector said there was no way one person could have moved it that far. It would have taken multiple people with proper equipment. And yet something had placed it over their well in the middle of the night and then pounded on their door hard enough to wake them up. The woman said they probably would have kept drinking that water for another week or 2 before getting sick enough to realize something was seriously wrong. By then, especially with the kids being so young, it could have been too late. The winter of 2019 brought heavy snows to the mountains around Willow Creek. Storm after storm rolled through, each one dumping another foot or two of snow on top of what was already there. By February, the snowpack was dangerously deep and unstable, layers upon layers that hadn't had time to settle and bond together properly. The avalanche risk was extreme. The Forest Service posted warnings at every trailhead, sent out alerts to residents in vulnerable areas, even went door to door in some neighborhoods to make sure people understood the danger. But not everyone saw them, and even when people did, not everyone understood how to read them or what they really meant. The language on avalanche warnings is technical, terms like angle of repose and weak layer formation, and most people don't have the training to translate that into real danger. A family lived in an isolated homestead in a narrow valley, one of those picturesque spots that looks perfect until you understand the terrain. Their cabin sat directly in an avalanche path, though they'd never had problems in the 20 years they'd lived there. The mother told me what happened in the middle of the night. She woke to violent shaking, like an earthquake, but more rhythmic, more deliberate. The whole cabin was rattling, dishes falling off shelves, pictures swinging on the walls. Her husband grabbed the kids and they all rushed outside in their pajamas, thinking the cabin was about to collapse. 30 seconds after they got outside, they heard a roar like thunder. The snow on the slope above their cabin gave way. Tons and tons of snow came sliding down, burying exactly where their cabin had been. If they had still been inside, none of them would have survived. In the morning, when rescuers reached them, they found massive prints in the snow leading away from the cabin. The prints suggested something enormous had been shaking the cabin, literally pushing against the walls to wake them up. The Forest Service investigator said the family had been incredibly lucky. Then he looked at the prints, looked at the family, and didn't say anything else. The avalanche buried their home completely. When they eventually excavated it in the spring, the cabin was destroyed, but they were alive, all of them, because something had known the avalanche was coming and had made sure they got out in time. 2 hunters told me about getting lost during a whiteout snowstorm in 2021. They'd separated from their group trying to track a deer and lost their bearings when the storm rolled in faster than predicted. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. They couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. They tried to retrace their steps, but everything looked the same. Trees, snow, more trees, more snow. The temperature was dropping fast, and they weren't dressed for an overnight stay. They tried to build a shelter, but they were too exhausted, too cold, hands too numb to do it properly. Both of them remembered lying down just for a minute, just to rest. That's usually when hypothermia takes you. You get tired, you lie down, you don't wake up. They both knew it was dangerous, but they couldn't help themselves. They woke up in a small cave at the base of a rock formation. There was a fire burning at the cave entrance, carefully maintained with a supply of dry wood stacked nearby. Pine boughs had been arranged as bedding underneath them. They were warm. Their wet clothes had been moved near the fire to dry. Enough firewood had been stacked to last through the night. When morning came and the storm cleared, they found markers outside the cave, large logs arranged to point toward the trail, almost like arrows. They followed the markers and found their way back to their group. Fresh tracks led away from the cave, massive barefoot prints in the new snow. The tracks were deep, showing significant weight, and they disappeared into the forest in a direction away from all the trails. Whatever had saved them had gone back into the wilderness, deeper into the places humans don't go. The wildfire season of 2018 was brutal. A fast-moving fire tore through the forest, driven by high winds and feeding on the dry timber. Evacuation orders went out, but an elderly widow who lived in an isolated cabin refused to leave. She had goats, chickens, a dog, and 2 cats. She wasn't going to abandon them. Firefighters tried to convince her to go, but she was stubborn. Eventually, they had to retreat. The fire was moving too fast, and they couldn't risk their own lives trying to force her out. Everyone assumed she'd perish. The fire swept through that area with intense heat, consuming everything in its path. When firefighters were finally able to return to the area, they found her property untouched. The fire had burned right up to her fence line on 3 sides and then stopped. Everything around her cabin was blackened and destroyed, but her property was fine. The grass was still green, the trees still had leaves, her animals were all safe. The widow told them she'd seen something creating a fire break around her property. She couldn't see it clearly through the smoke, but she saw a massive silhouette moving frantically around the perimeter of her land, tearing up bushes, throwing dirt, clearing everything that could burn. She said it moved with purpose, with intelligence, working methodically to protect her home. Fire investigators had no explanation for why the fire stopped where it did. The wind hadn't changed direction. There was no natural fire break. The vegetation was the same on both sides of her fence line. One investigator mentioned, almost as a joke, that it looked like someone had manually cleared a break. But that would have taken hours of work by multiple people, and it had all happened during the fire itself. The widow lived there for 3 more years before passing away peacefully in her sleep. She told people she knew she was protected, that something in the forest looked after her because she had always looked after the land. On my last night in Willow Creek, I decided to take a hike. I'd been listening to stories all week but hadn't experienced anything myself. Part of me wanted to, and part of me was afraid to. I chose a trail that was supposed to be easy, well-marked, not too long. I started out around dusk, which wasn't the smartest decision. The light was already fading, making everything look different than it had when I'd checked out the trailhead that morning. I told myself I'd just walk for 30 minutes and turn back, but 30 minutes became 45, and I got turned around somewhere. All the trails started to look the same. Trees, rocks, more trees, more rocks. Every turn looked familiar, but nothing was actually familiar. I tried to retrace my steps, but I wasn't sure which way I'd come from. Had I passed that particular boulder before? Was this the same fallen log I'd stepped over 10 minutes ago, or was it a different one? My phone was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it at the motel that morning, too distracted by all the stories I'd been hearing. The darkness was coming fast in the way it does in the mountains, no gradual twilight that gives you time to adjust. Just sudden night, like someone throwing a blanket over the world. The temperature was dropping too. I could feel it in the air, that bite that tells you it's going to be a cold night. My breath was starting to fog. I sat down on a log, trying not to panic. That's what they tell you to do when you're lost, right? Stop moving, stay calm, conserve energy. But it's hard to stay calm when you realize you're genuinely lost in the wilderness with no phone, no flashlight, no water, no way to let anyone know where you are. The temperature was dropping fast. I wasn't dressed for an overnight stay. I had a light jacket, jeans, hiking boots that were comfortable but not insulated. I didn't have water, didn't have food, didn't have anything useful. I'd been stupid, distracted by all the stories I'd been collecting, thinking I could just take a quick walk before dinner. Now that quick walk had turned into something much more serious. The forest was getting darker by the minute, and I had no idea which direction led back to town. That's when I heard the movement. Something large pushing through the underbrush, not trying to be quiet. I froze. The sound stopped. Then a smell hit me, musky, like a wet dog, but stronger, earthier, almost overwhelming. It was the smell of something wild, something that lived in these woods and belonged here in a way I didn't. I saw movement in the shadows just beyond where I could see clearly. Something big moving between the trees. The snapping of branches was deliberate, purposeful. Whatever it was circling my position, staying just out of sight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But here's the strange part. I didn't feel threatened. The fear I felt wasn't the fear of being prey. It was the fear of being in the presence of something much larger and more powerful than myself, something I didn't understand. Like standing near the edge of a cliff, not because something's going to push you, but because you're aware of how small you are and how big the drop is. Then I heard a sharp crack, like a thick branch breaking. I turned toward the sound and saw a large branch lying across the trail I'd been following. It hadn't been there before. It was blocking the direction I'd been going, placed deliberately across the path. Another crack, this time perpendicular to the first. Another branch, placed to point in a different direction. The message was clear. Don't go that way, go this way. I followed the new direction. I could feel something moving parallel to me, staying in the shadows just beyond sight. The presence was constant but not aggressive. It felt more like being escorted than being chased. The path led downhill, and after about 20 minutes, I saw lights in the distance. Town? I'd been heading in completely the wrong direction, deeper into the forest. I looked back one time before I left the tree line. On a ridge behind me, backlit by the rising moon, stood a massive silhouette. Easily 8 feet tall, broad shoulders, human-shaped but too large to be human. I stared at it. It didn't move. I looked away for just a second to watch my footing on the slope, and when I looked back, it was gone. The next morning, I sat in the motel office having coffee with the owner. I told her what happened. She didn't look surprised. She just nodded and said, "You're one of us now." She explained something I'd been starting to understand on my own. The creature doesn't help everyone. It helps those who belong here or those who respect the forest. People who live here and care for the land. People who are genuinely lost and vulnerable, not just thrill seekers looking for a story. But hunters who show no respect, who trash the forest and kill more than they need, they get mysteriously lost for days. Sometimes they find their way out, sometimes search and rescue has to find them. Loggers who try to overcut, taking more trees than permitted. Equipment failures, accidents that aren't quite accidents, trucks that won't start. Teenagers on ATVs tearing up sensitive habitat. Their vehicles end up pushed into ravines and they have to walk home. The motel owner said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. The forest has a protector, and that protector watches over those who deserve it. It protects those who protect it. I spent my last few hours in Willow Creek thinking about all the stories I'd heard. Every single one shared the same elements. Someone vulnerable, someone in genuine danger, someone who couldn't save themselves. And every single time, something intervened. Something large, something intelligent, something that understood human vulnerability and chose to help. The creature never stays to be thanked. It never seeks recognition or reward. It just acts and then disappears back into the forest, back into the wilderness. That's its real home. The people of Willow Creek understand this. They protect the creature's privacy the same way it protects their lives. They don't invite researchers. They don't encourage publicity. They're polite but reserved with visitors who ask too many questions. They've learned that some things are more valuable when they're kept secret, when they're protected rather than exposed. I packed up my things and loaded my car. Before I left town, I took one last drive around, trying to memorize the mountains, the trees, the way the morning mist settled in the valleys. This place had changed something in me. I'd come here skeptical, maybe even cynical, and I was leaving with more questions than answers. As I drove out of town on the winding mountain road, I saw something massive cross the road far ahead. Just a glimpse, there and gone, disappearing into the trees on the opposite side. I slowed down, but by the time I reached the spot, there was nothing there. Just massive prints in the muddy shoulder, already filling with morning rain. I looked into the forest one last time. The trees were dense, the shadows deep, I couldn't see anything, but I felt certain I was being watched. Not with hostility or threat, but with something else. Understanding, maybe, or just acknowledgement that I'd been there, that I'd listened, that I'd learned something. I realized then that every story I'd heard shared one final common thread. The creature chooses vulnerability over strength, genuine need over casual curiosity, protection over recognition. It acts not because it wants something from humans, but because helping is simply what it does. Bigfoot doesn't seek credit. It doesn't want fame or proof of its existence. It lives in the deep forest, in the wild places humans rarely go, and it watches over those who respect its home. The people of Willow Creek have an unspoken agreement with their guardian. They protect its privacy, and it protects their lives. As I drove away, watching Willow Creek disappear in my rearview mirror, I understood something else. I'd been trusted with these stories. People had shared their experiences with me, knowing I was writing a book, hoping I would tell their stories the right way. Not sensationalized, not mocked, not turned into entertainment for people who don't understand. I've spent months since then trying to figure out what to do with what I learned in Willow Creek. I've interviewed people in other towns, heard other stories, but none of them have the same ring of truth. None of them share that consistent thread of protection and care. Whatever lives in the forests around Willow Creek is unique, and the relationship between that creature and the town is something rare and precious. Some mysteries deserve protection more than exposure. Some secrets should stay secret, not because they're dangerous, but because they're fragile. The people of Willow Creek know this. They've kept their guardian safe for generations by simply not talking about it too much, by being careful about who they trust with their stories. I'm writing this down because these stories need to be preserved, but I'm leaving out last names, specific locations, exact dates. The details that would let someone retrace my steps and turn Willow Creek into a tourist destination. This town doesn't need that. Its guardian doesn't need that. I still think about that silhouette on the ridge, backlit by moonlight. The memory is crystal clear, even though it only lasted a second. The massive shape, the broad shoulders, the sense of something ancient and powerful watching me from the darkness. I think about the deliberate placement of those branches, guiding me home when I was truly lost. I think about all those people who were saved by something they'll never fully understand. The lost boy wrapped in pine boughs, the couple pulled from the burning car, the old man dragged from his smoke-filled cabin, the girl lifted from the drowning current. And I wonder if maybe belief isn't the point at all. Maybe respect is the point. Maybe recognizing that there are things in this world larger than ourselves, things we should protect rather than prove. Things that deserve privacy and space to exist without being studied or photographed or turned into entertainment. Maybe that's all that really matters. Maybe the truest way to honor something is to let it remain mysterious. The last thing the motel owner said to me before I left was this. She said the creature has been protecting Willow Creek since before the town existed, since before white settlers came to these mountains. It protected the Native Americans who lived here first. It protected the early pioneers. It protects the town now. And it will probably be here long after all of us are gone, still watching over whoever makes these mountains their home, still pulling lost children from the forest and broken bodies from burning cars. She said, "We don't own this protection. We're just grateful for it. And we try to earn it every day by taking care of the forest the way it takes care of us." I believe her. I believe all of them. Not because I have proof, not because I can explain it, but because I was there. I felt that presence in the forest. I saw that silhouette on the ridge. I followed those branches home. Sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones we can prove. They're the ones we choose to believe because they teach us something about how to live, about vulnerability and protection, about respect and reciprocity, about understanding that we share this world with things we may never fully know, and that's okay. Willow Creek's guardian has been keeping people safe for generations. Not all of them, not the ones who don't deserve it, but the ones who do. The vulnerable, the lost, the genuinely endangered. And in return, Willow Creek keeps the guardian secret. That seems like a fair trade to me. For more interesting stories, check this out.